The dust came like a living thing, blotting out the sun over the prairie in minutes. Nayati had seen storms before, watched them swallow war parties whole on the plains north of the greasy grass. But this one rolled across the land with a fury that suggested the earth itself had grown tired of men walking upon it. He pulled his hat lower, squinting through the grit that stung his eyes, and urged his mule toward the only shelter visible, a sagging telegraph station a quarter-mile east of Red Oak. The building leaned westward, its clapboards warped by years of wind and neglect. One window hung from a single hinge, banging rhythmically against the frame. Nayati tied the mule to a post that groaned under the animal's weight and pushed through the door just as the storm's leading edge struck with full force. Inside, the air was thick with dust, filtering through gaps in the walls. A single lantern swung from a ceiling beam, casting wild shadows across the cramped space. And there, at a battered desk, bolted to the floor, sat a woman hunched over a telegraph key, her fingers dancing across the brass with practiced urgency. She did not look up. "Close the door. Latch it." Nayati obeyed, throwing the bolt just as something heavy, a shutter perhaps, or a section of roof, slammed against the outer wall. The woman's hand never faltered. Dots and dashes clicked through the room, a language Nayati recognized from his scouting days when army officers had relied on wires to coordinate movements, and he was meant to betray. "Will it hold?" he asked, nodding toward the ceiling. "No." She finished her sequence, released the key, and finally turned to face him. She was perhaps 28, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a severe knot, and eyes the color of storm clouds that assessed him without warmth or fear. Her dress was plain gray cotton, buttoned to the throat sleeves to the wrists. No jewelry, no softness. "The roof will go first, then the walls." As if summoned by her words, a tremendous crack echoed overhead. The lantern's flame jumped, and Nayati saw what she had not yet noticed: oil seeping from the base, where the storm's vibrations had loosened the reservoir cap. A thin stream traced down the beam, pooling on the desk's edge inches from scattered papers. "The lantern," he said sharply. She turned, saw the danger, and moved with startling speed. Her hands darted to the papers, sweeping them into a leather satchel, while Nayati stripped off his coat, worn canvas over buckskin, chosen to avoid attention, and wrapped it around the lantern's base. The fabric smoked. He gritted his teeth against the heat and twisted the reservoir cap tight, stopping the leak. "Cellar," the woman said, nodding toward a trap door partially hidden beneath a threadbare rug. Now. They descended narrow steps into blackness. Nayati carried the lantern, now re-wrapped and secured. The woman Alice, he would learn her name soon enough, pulled the trapdoor shut above them, and the storm's roar became muffled, a distant beast prowling overhead. The cellar was barely 8 feet square, its walls raw earth shored up with rotting timbers. A few crates lined one side, labeled in faded ink. Alice moved to the corner, where an iron pry bar leaned against the wall, and brought it to the trapdoor. She wedged one end against the frame and braced the other against a support beam. "Hold this," she instructed. Nayati set the lantern on a crate and positioned himself beside her, his hands closing over the bar just above hers. Their shoulders pressed together as they put their combined weight against the makeshift brace. Above them, the storm hammered the station with renewed violence. Wood shrieked, glass shattered, something massive crashed through the outer wall. The lantern flame flickered, threatening to die, and with it their only source of light in this earthen tomb. Alice's breathing quickened almost imperceptibly, and Nayati felt the tension in her frame, not panic, but the coiled readiness of someone who had survived threats before and knew the cost of hesitation. "Fueled by lamp oil." "What were you sending?" Nayati asked, partly to distract them both from the groaning timbers overhead. "A final report. The lines have been failing for 2 days. I needed to get it through before they snapped completely." She paused, then added, "It went." I felt the acknowledgement click. "You know Morse. Enough to stay alive." Her sleeve had ridden up during the scramble, revealing her wrist where she gripped the bar. In the lantern's uncertain light, Nayati glimpsed what she had not intended him to see, a line of pale scars, thin and deliberate, running parallel across the inner wrist and extending toward the palm. Not the chaotic marks of accident or desperation, but the precise cuts of something else, something defensive, controlled, and intimate with a blade. He said nothing. He had his own scars hidden beneath the layers he wore to pass as blind Otis. The tinker, a harmless wanderer mending pots and harness for settlers who never looked too closely at his face. The bone breastplate and single-trail war bonnet of his people stayed wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his pack, revealed only in the Lakota camps, where his name still meant something. Elsewhere, such items could bring soldiers and ropes. Alice adjusted her grip, and the sleeve slipped further. She glanced down, saw what he had seen, and met his eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm raged above them, but in that cellar, in that flickering light, time seemed to slow. "I was a physician's assistant," she said quietly, as though explaining something trivial. "In Philadelphia. There was an incident. A man with a surgical knife. I took it from him." It was not the whole truth. Nayati could hear the careful editing in her voice. But it was enough. Enough to tell him she had fought for her life and won. Enough to understand why she lived alone in a failing telegraph station on the edge of nowhere, sending messages to people who might not care. The storm raged on. They held the door together, their breathing sinking in the dim space, shoulders, braced hands aligned on the iron. When their fingers shifted to ease, cramping his thumb brushed her knuckles. She did not pull away. Instead, her hand turned slightly, just enough that their palms met for a heartbeat before she repositioned her grip. "Your name?" she asked after a long silence. "Nayati." He hesitated. "They call me Otis in town." "Which do you prefer?" "The one that keeps me breathing." She nodded, understanding perfectly. "Alice." No other name needed. Above them, the storm began to ease, its fury spending itself across the prairie. The timbers stopped groaning. The wind's howl faded to a moan, then a whisper. They held the brace a minute longer, then two, until the silence convinced them the worst had passed. When they climbed back into the station, the roof was gone, the sky above was clear, and merciless stars burning in the dark, like distant fires that had outlasted countless storms before this one. Dawn broke over Red Oak like a curse. The dust storm had scoured the town, clean stripping paint from walls and toppling the church's bell tower. Main Street was buried under drifts of sand and debris. The town pump stood bent at an angle, its handles snapped the trough beneath it, bone dry. Cattle huddled in skeletal clusters near the stockyard, their ribs visible through hide stretched tight over bone, their eyes dull with the kind of resignation that came from months of drought. Nayati emerged from the telegraph station with Alice and surveyed the damage. The mule had survived, though its tether had snapped, and he found the animal sheltering in the lee of a collapsed barn. He checked its legs and hooves, murmuring in Lakota, then led it back to the main street where early risers were beginning to assess their losses. Alice lingered at the station's threshold, reluctant to step fully into the light. Nayati watched her pull a shawl over her head, arranging it to shadow her face, and retrieve a canvas bag from beneath the ruined desk. She did not look at him as she moved toward the back of the building, where a small room, her quarters he assumed, remained partially intact. The way she moved spoke of years spent minimizing her presence, of making herself small and forgettable. He did not follow. Instead, he set up his tinker's station beneath the overhang of the general store, laying out his tools on a scrap of oilcloth pliers, wire, a small anvil, a leather punch. He wore his usual disguise, faded blue shirt, buckskin trousers, battered hat, and kept his gaze down as townsfolk began to pass. Some nodded, others ignored him. A few muttered about that Injun tinker, the words spoken just loud enough for him to hear, but not loud enough to require acknowledgement. By mid-morning, 3 figures approached with requests. First came Dr. Silas Greer, a lean man in his 50s, with a gray beard and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He carried a medical bag whose brass clasp had broken, and he set it down with a sigh that spoke of too many house calls and not enough sleep. "Can you fix this? The hinge is cracked and I need it sealed tight for house calls." Nayati examined the break, noted the clean fracture in the brass, and nodded. "I can rivet it. Come back in an hour." Greer smiled. "Fair enough. I'll pay in bandages. I know you people use them for trading." "We use them for wounds, same as you," Nayati replied evenly, meeting the doctor's eyes for just long enough to make his point. "But bandages are acceptable." The doctor blinked, then chuckled softly and walked away, shaking his head as though amused at himself. Next was Mabel Finch, a schoolteacher in her mid-30s, with auburn hair pulled into a practical bun and a determined set to her jaw. She brought a broken slate frame and a tin of cornbread wrapped in cloth. "For your trouble," she said, setting the tin beside his tools. "The children have been asking about you. They like the stories you tell when you come to the schoolyard." "I will fix the frame," Nayati said. "The bread is generous." "It is nothing." Mabel lowered her voice, glancing toward the telegraph station. "Is Alice all right? I saw her station lost its roof." "She is unharmed." "Good. She does not speak to many, but I worry." Mabel hesitated, her fingers worrying at the edge of her shawl. "If she needs anything, tell her I have extra supplies. A woman alone out here." "I will tell her." Mabel nodded and left her skirts stirring the dust. The third visitor was Ephraim Tully, a farmer in his early 40s with sunburned skin and calloused hands that spoke of decades working unforgiving land. He limped slightly, an old injury from a plow accident, and carried a broken hoe handle. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and his eyes held the weariness of a man fighting a battle he knew he might lose. "Can you fit a new shaft? The old one split last night in the storm." "I can." Nayati measured the socket. "But I will need wood. Do you have ash or hickory?" "I have hickory scraps at the farm. I will bring them tomorrow." Ephraim paused, then added in a lower voice, "You see them." He nodded toward the stockyard where a group of men in Eastern clothes were unloading surveying equipment from a wagon. Their boots were too clean, their hands too soft. Railroad men. "Came in 2 days ago, sniffing around for land. They want my farm." "Will you sell?" "Not while I am breathing." Ephraim spat into the dirt. "My wife is sick. I owe debts. But that land is mine. My father cleared that ground. My son is buried there under the cedar tree. That means something even if it means nothing to them." Nayati looked at the farmer and saw something of himself, a man trying to hold on to a piece of earth in a world that was determined to take it away. "It means something," he said quietly. Ephraim met his eyes, and something passed between them, an understanding that transcended the color of their skin or the particulars of their circumstances. They were both men who had lost too much and refused to lose more. "You understand," Ephraim said. It was not a question. "I do." Ephraim nodded once and then limped away. Nayati turned his attention to the medical bag, working the rivet into place with steady hands. Around him, red oak stirred to reluctant life. The saloon opened. The blacksmith lit his forge sparks, rising like fireflies. Children chased a hoop down the street, their laughter thin and tired. And from the telegraph station, Alice emerged. She wore a different dress, dark blue, equally plain, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast her face in deep shadow. She walked with purpose toward the general store, avoiding eye contact with anyone she passed. Her movements were efficient, calculated, as though she had mapped every step in advance to minimize interaction. As she reached the store's entrance, a man stepped out, a rancher named Howell, heavy-set and red-faced from drink, despite the early hour. He looked at Alice, then at Nayati, working across the street, and his lip curled. "That Injun bothering you, miss?" He called out loud enough for half the street to hear. Alice stopped. "No, he saved my life last night." "Saved your life?" Howell laughed, a harsh sound. "More likely sizing up what he can steal. You shouldn't trust his kind. They're all thieves and murderers." Alice's expression remained calm, but her voice dropped to a temperature that could freeze water. "Then it is fortunate. I am not asking for your counsel on whom to trust." She entered the store, leaving Howell sputtering. Nayati kept his head down, focusing on his work, but he had heard every word. And he had seen the way Alice had defended him without hesitation, without calculation. It was not kindness. He did not think she had much of that left to spare. It was something simpler and more valuable: fairness. By noon, the surveying crew had moved to the center of town. Their leader was a man in his 30s, dressed in a fine wool suit despite the heat, with slicked-back hair and a calculating gaze that swept over the town as though appraising property rather than people. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and a rolled map under the other. His name, Nayati would learn, was Harlan Pike, and he spoke with the clipped precision of an Easterner accustomed to being obeyed. Pike's men spread out, taking measurements and driving stakes into the ground. One of them approached Ephraim's farm on the edge of town and began arguing with the farmer. Nayati could not hear the words, but he saw Ephraim shove the man back, saw the man stumble, saw two others move to intervene. The confrontation escalated until Dr. Greer stepped between them hands, raised voice calm, his presence enough to diffuse the immediate violence. But the sheriff, a portly man named Willard, who owed more loyalty to whoever paid him than to any notion of justice, ambled over and spoke quietly with Pike's man. Money changed hands, subtle but unmistakable. Willard then turned to Ephraim and said something that made the farmer's face go pale. Ephraim walked away, shoulders slumped, defeated without a single blow being struck. Nayati filed that away. The law here belonged to whoever could afford it. That afternoon, the town pump's remaining bracket snapped with a sharp crack. The metal rod whipped free, spinning toward Alice, who had approached to refill her canteen. Nayati moved without thinking, crossing the distance in 3 strides and catching the rod with his bare hand. The edge bit into his palm, drawing blood, but the rod stopped inches from her throat. Alice stared at him, her storm cloud eyes wide with shock. "Thank you," she said quietly. He released the rod, letting it clatter to the ground, and examined his hand. The cut was shallow but long, stretching from the base of his thumb to his wrist, blood welling bright against his skin. "Let me see." Alice set down her canteen and reached for his hand, but he pulled back. "It is nothing." "It is bleeding. Sit." She gestured toward the edge of the trough. When he hesitated, she added, "I know how to close wounds. Sit." He obeyed. Alice retrieved a strip of cloth from her bag, wet it from her canteen, and cleaned the blood with careful efficiency. Her hands were steady, her touch light but confident. She worked without speaking, and Nayati found himself watching her face, noting the faint lines around her eyes and the tightness at the corners of her mouth. She was tired. No more than tired, worn down by something deeper than lack of sleep. There was a weight in her expression, a guardedness that spoke of years spent looking over her shoulder. She wrapped the cloth around his palm and tied it snugly. "Change this tonight. If it swells, see Dr. Greer. I will." She stepped back, and for a moment they stood in silence. Then Alice picked up her canteen, filled it from the dipper Nayati had rescued from the wreckage, and offered him the first drink. He took it, swallowed once, and handed it back. "You should drink. You have had no water since last night. I have had enough. You have not." She met his gaze, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of mutual stubbornness, perhaps, or simply the recognition that neither would yield easily. Finally, she drank, then capped the canteen. But this time she did not walk away immediately. She stood beside him for a moment longer, her shoulder nearly touching his, and looked out at the devastated town. "They will rebuild," she said quietly. "Will they, or will they just wait for the next storm to knock it down again? I suppose that depends on whether they have anything worth rebuilding for." Nayati looked at her. "Do you?" She did not answer, but the silence itself was answer enough. By evening, Harlan Pike had distributed handbills throughout town. Nayati saw one tacked to the general store's wall and stopped to read it. The paper was fine quality, the printing crisp, and professional reward for information. Regarding the whereabouts of Miss Alice Garrett, formerly of Philadelphia. Wanted in connection with matters of estate settlement. Inquiries to be directed to H. Pike, Esquire. Below the text was a sketch, rough but recognizable, of a woman with dark blonde hair and sharp features. The artist had captured the set of her jaw, the directness of her gaze. Nayati tore the handbill down and shoved it into his coat. His mind raced. Alice had given no surname, but the face on the paper was hers. And Harlan Pike, with his Eastern suit and surveying maps, was not merely a railroad man. He was hunting someone. Nayati returned to his mule and began packing his tools. The sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of blood and gold, the light harsh and unforgiving. Soldiers patrolled the outskirts of town, their presence a constant reminder that the West belonged to the army. Now not to the people who had lived here first. Their blue uniforms stood out against the prairie like bruises. He glanced toward the telegraph station. Alice stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the horizon. She did not see him looking, and he did not call out. But he made a decision in that moment, one that would tether him to her fate, whether she wanted it or not. Trouble was coming, and when it arrived, she would not face it alone. The second storm struck at dusk, rolling in from the northwest with less dust but more violence. Wind tore through red oak, like a living fist ripping shutters from walls and sending livestock scattering in panic. Nayati was securing his mule in the livery when he heard the crack, sharp and final, of a telegraph pole snapping. He turned and saw the line sag, then fall, its wire coiling in the dirt like a dying snake. Alice was already running toward it from the station, her hat blown free, her hair whipping in the wind. She reached the pole and stared at the severed line, her face blank, with the kind of shock that came from losing something irreplaceable. Nayati left the mule and crossed the street. "Is it gone?" he asked. "Yes." Her voice was flat. "The backup line failed 2 days ago. This was the last connection. No more messages in or out." Before he could respond, voices erupted from the direction of the station. Harlan Pike and 4 of his men were striding toward the building, their coats flapping in the wind like dark wings. Pike carried the rolled map under one arm and a lantern in the other. His expression was grim, his jaw set with the determination of someone who had traveled far for a specific purpose. "Miss Garrett," he called over the wind. "A word, if you please." Alice stiffened. She did not turn. "I have nothing to say to you." That is unfortunate. I have business with the telegraph station, and you are currently occupying it. Pike reached the doorway and pushed it open without waiting for permission. His men followed, their boots heavy on the warped floorboards, their movements practiced and aggressive. Nayati stepped closer to Alice. Who is he? No one. She started toward the station, but Nayati caught her arm the first time he had touched her deliberately, his grip firm but not harsh. He knows your name. You should not go in there alone. He cannot. She stopped, her eyes darting to the handbill Nayati had tucked into his coat pocket, the corner visible. Understanding dawned. You saw the notice? Yes. Then you know I am in trouble. I know someone wants you found. I do not know why. She pulled free of his grip and walked toward the station. Nayati followed his hand, drifting to the knife at his belt, a simple blade balanced for throwing or close work hidden beneath his coat. He had carried it since the greasy grass, and it had tasted blood more than once. Inside, Pike's men were tearing through the station with brutal efficiency. They overturned crates, ripped up floorboards, and scattered papers across the floor. One of them found a hidden compartment beneath the desk and pried it open with a crowbar, revealing a leather-bound ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The sound of splintering wood filled the small space. Stop! Alice lunged forward, but one of the men, a broad-shouldered brute with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, blocked her path. She struck his arm, but he shoved her back with casual violence, and she stumbled into Nayati, who steadied her without taking his eyes off Pike. Pike lifted the ledger, unwrapped it with deliberate slowness, and opened it to the first page. His expression shifted satisfaction mingled with something darker, something almost vindictive. Well, he said softly, here we are. That is mine. Alice said, her voice shaking with fury. You have no right. On the contrary, Miss Garrett, I have every right. Pike turned to face her, the ledger open in his hands. This contains your autopsy notes, does it not? Records from your work in Philadelphia, including the case of my grandfather, Ambrose Pike. Alice said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. My grandfather died 6 years ago. Pike continued, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. The official cause was an aneurysm. Natural causes. But there were questions, Miss Garrett. Questions about whether he had been poisoned. Questions that you, as the physician's assistant, were uniquely positioned to answer. I answered them, Alice said coldly. I conducted the autopsy. I found no evidence of poisoning. I filed my report. And yet, rumors persisted. Enough to prompt a review of my grandfather's will, which left a significant portion of his estate to charitable causes that interfered with my family's interests. Pike snapped the ledger shut. You see my dilemma. If the autopsy was accurate, the will stands. If it was not, it was accurate. Alice's hands clenched at her sides. Your grandfather died of natural causes. I staked my reputation on that finding. Then why? Pike said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Did the telegraph report filed on the same day suggest otherwise? Alice went pale. That is impossible. I sent my findings directly to Judge Mercer. There was no ambiguity. Judge Mercer, as a circuit authority in the territory, could convene a special term and forward the record to a grand jury if warranted. Alice's duty was to deliver her findings into that chain, which she had done. And yet the copy received in Philadelphia stated that poisoning could not be ruled out. A curious discrepancy, do you not think? Pike tucked the ledger under his arm. I intend to resolve this matter once and for all. You will accompany me back east, where we will present your notes to a proper tribunal. I will not. Then I will take the ledger and let the tribunal decide in your absence. Either way, Miss Garrett, your time here is finished. Nayati stepped forward, placing himself between Alice and Pike. She said no. Pike's gaze shifted to him, cold and dismissive. This does not concern you, Tinker. It does now. For a moment the room was silent, except for the wind howling through the broken roof. Then Pike nodded to his men. Remove him. The first man reached for Nayati's shoulder. Nayati pivoted, drove his elbow into the man's ribs with enough force to crack bone, and shoved him into the second. Both stumbled. The third drew a revolver, but Nayati was already moving, pulling Alice toward the rear of the station, where a trap door led to the cellar. Cellar, he said, his voice urgent. Now. Alice did not argue. She dropped through the trapdoor, and Nayati followed, pulling the door shut above them. Footsteps thundered overhead. A gunshot cracked, splintering the trapdoor's edgewood fragments raining down. But by then, they were already climbing out through the rear exit, a narrow gap in the foundation that opened into the yard behind the station. The storm had intensified, turning the world into a blur of wind and flying debris. Nayati guided Alice toward the rail yard, where stacks of lumber and iron pilings provided cover. A second gunshot rang out, striking the ground near his boot, kicking up dirt. He grabbed Alice's wrist and pulled her down behind a pile of cut timber splinters raining over them as another shot tore through the wood. Here, he said, pressing his knife into her hand. The handle was still warm from being against his body. If they take us, use this. Aim for the throat or the belly. Do not hesitate. Alice looked at the blade, then at him. Her storm cloud eyes were clear, her fear buried beneath something harder. I will not need it. We are not getting caught. Good. They crawled through the yard using the storm as cover until they reached the fence line. Nayati boosted Alice over, then vaulted after her. On the other side, they ran east away from town toward the river, where the prairie opened into scrubland, and the land remembered its wildness. Behind them, Pike's voice rose above the wind, sharp with fury. Find them. I want that ledger and the woman alive if possible, but I will settle for the ledger alone. Nayati did not look back. He kept his hand on Alice's elbow, guiding her through the darkness, and felt her match his pace without faltering. She was stronger than she looked, faster than he had expected. Whatever had happened in Philadelphia, it had forged her into something resilient. They ran until the lights of Red Oak faded behind them, swallowed by the storm and the night. The riverbank was a tangle of willows and mud, the water swollen from recent rains upstream. Nayati and Alice stumbled through the underbrush, their clothes soaked, their breathing ragged. The storm had eased slightly, but the wind still gusted hard enough to make standing difficult. Nayati scanned the darkness, searching for shelter, and spotted a faint glow, a head firelight, flickering through the trees. There, he said, nodding toward the light. They approached cautiously and found Ephraim Tully battling a brush fire that had ignited near his shack. Sparks from Pike's camp, or perhaps from a lantern knocked over in the chaos, had caught the dry grass, and the flames were spreading toward the small structure where Ephraim's wife lay ill. Ephraim beat at the fire with a soaked blanket, his face blackened with soot, his movements frantic but losing ground. The flames climbed higher, crackling with hunger. "Help me," he shouted when he saw them. "The shack my wife is inside." Nayati did not hesitate. He grabbed a water barrel near the door and began dousing the flames, while Ephraim continued to smother them with the blanket. Alice ran to the shack, threw open the door, and helped Ephraim's wife, a frail woman in her 50s, fevered and weak, her nightgown soaked with sweat, out into the yard. She guided her to a safe distance, wrapping her in a dry shawl she found hanging on a post. The fire fought back, feeding on the wind and the drought-dried grass, but together they contained it. Nayati's hands blistered from the heat, and his lungs burned from the smoke, but he did not stop until the last ember was extinguished. When it was done, Ephraim collapsed onto his knees, coughing violently. Thank you, he rasped, looking up at Nayati. I owe you my life. You owe me nothing. Nayati wiped soot from his face. But we need to move. Pike's men are close. Ephraim nodded, then struggled to his feet. He reached into his coat, pulling out the leather-bound ledger. I took this from the station during the search, saw them tearing the place apart, and figured anything worth that much effort was worth protecting. Alice stared at him, then at the ledger, her expression unreadable. You should not have done that. They will come after you now. They are already coming after me. The railroad wants my land. They have been threatening me for weeks. Ephraim handed her the ledger, then gripped her shoulder. Listen to me. My father fought in the war back east. He told me once that a man's worth is measured by what he is willing to lose for what is right. I do not know what is in that book, but I know it matters to you. So keep it safe, whatever it costs. Alice took the ledger, her hands trembling slightly. I will not forget this. I know you will not. Ephraim turned to Nayati. You are protecting her. I am. Good. She needs someone who knows how to fight. Ephraim looked back toward his shack where his wife sat wrapped in the shawl, and his expression softened. Go. I will slow them down if I can. Nayati gripped his shoulder, once a brief acknowledgement between men who understood what it meant to stand against impossible odds, then led Alice toward the river. They waded into the shallows, the current tugging at their boots, and followed the water downstream. The cold bit through their clothes, numbing their legs, but it also masked their tracks, muffled the sound of their passage. A branch caught Alice's collar, tearing the fabric and exposing the scars on her collarbone, thin parallel lines like those on her wrist. Nayati saw them in the moonlight and understood that they were not accidents. They were deliberate defensive, the marks of someone who had fought a man with a blade and survived. He said nothing. Instead, he scooped muddy water from the riverbank and gently applied it to her exposed skin, concealing the scars beneath a layer of grime. Alice watched him, her eyes wide, and when he finished, she unwrapped the cloth from his injured palm and retied it with her scarf, the one he had adjusted for her earlier, now used to bind his wound. This is yours, he said quietly. It is more useful here. Their faces were close, their foreheads nearly touching, as he secured the knot with his teeth. For a moment, neither moved. He could feel the warmth of her breath against his cheek, despite the cold water swirling around them. Then Alice stepped back, and they continued downstream the river, carrying them away from the fire and the men who hunted them. Behind them, Pike's voice echoed through the night, distant but relentless. Search the river. They cannot have gone far. Nayati tightened his grip on Alice's hand and pulled her deeper into the current. The water rose to their waists, icy and unforgiving, but it was their only path forward. They waded in silence the riverbank, growing steeper, the trees thinning until at last the land opened into prairie again. And in the distance, Nayati saw the flicker of campfires. The Lakota summer camp. He had not intended to bring her here, had hoped to avoid drawing his people into this trouble. But there was no other choice. Pike would not stop. The ledger was evidence of something larger, something worth killing for, and Alice could not survive alone. That is where we are going, he said, nodding toward the fires. Alice followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. Will they help us? Some will. Others. He trailed off. They will not trust you, but they will trust me. That will have to be enough. They climbed out of the river and walked across the prairie, their clothes dripping their bodies, exhausted. As they approached the camp, Nayati felt the weight of what he was asking, not just of his people, but of Alice. To enter a Lakota camp as an outsider was to step into a world governed by rules she could not know, bound by loyalties she had not earned. But she walked beside him without hesitation, her chin raised, her stride steady. Whatever fear she felt, she buried it deep. The camp rose before them, a circle of teepees, outlined against the stars, and Nayati led her toward the council fire, where the elders would decide their fate. The Lakota summer camp sprawled across a grassy hillside, its teepees arranged in a wide circle around a central fire that burned bright against the night. Smoke rose into the sky, carrying the scent of roasted meat and sage. Pony herds grazed on the slopes below, their silhouettes dark against the moonlit prairie. Drying racks stood near the camp's edge, hung with strips of venison, and children had been playing between the lodges before the late hour sent them to their beds. Nayati led Alice through the camp, his presence parting the crowd like water. Faces turned to watch, curiosity, suspicion, and recognition mingling in their expressions. He wore no disguise here, no carefully constructed facade of blind Otis. He was Nayati's son of the greasy grass scout turned warrior. And though his people had suffered under the army's heel, his name still carried weight. But Alice was different. She was Wasakue white, and her presence here was an intrusion, a violation of boundaries that had been drawn in blood and betrayal. A woman near one of the teepees spat into the dirt as they passed. A young warrior, his face painted with symbols of mourning for lost family, stepped forward and blocked their path. "Why do you bring her here?" the warrior demanded in Lakota, his voice sharp with anger. "The Wasakue take our land, kill our people, break every promise they make. And you bring one into our camp." "She needs protection," Nayati replied, also in Lakota. "She is hunted by men who would kill her. Let them. Why should we care about her life when they care nothing for ours?" "Because we are not them." Nayati met the warrior's eyes. "Because we judge people by their actions, not their blood. And because I vouch for her." The warrior hesitated, then stepped aside, but his expression remained hostile. Others murmured among themselves, and Nayati knew that his decision to bring Alice here had cost him something. Trust was a currency in short supply, and he had just spent some of his. An elder stepped forward, a man in his 60s with long gray braids and a face lined by years of hardship. He wore a buckskin shirt and leggings, and his eyes were sharp despite his age. This was Mato Tuelk, a veteran of countless battles, a man who had fought beside Nayati's father and owed the family a debt. "Nayati," Mato said, his voice gravelly, "you bring trouble to our fire." "I bring a woman who needs protection," Nayati replied. "And trouble that is already here." Mato's gaze shifted to Alice, who stood beside Nayati with her hands clasped in front of her, her clothes torn and muddy, her face pale but composed. He spoke to her in English, his accent thick but clear. "Who are you?" "Alice Garrett. I was a physician's assistant in Philadelphia. I am being pursued by a man who wishes me harm." "Why?" "Because I possess evidence of his crimes." Mato studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Nayati. "You vouch for her?" "I do." "Then she may stay. But if trouble follows, it will fall on your shoulders." "I accept that." Mato nodded and gestured toward the fire. "Sit. We will speak of this." Nayati guided Alice to a spot near the fire and sat beside her. The camp's residents gathered around, their faces curious and wary. Among them was an older woman, perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair braided down her back and hands stained from years of preparing medicines. This was Winyan, the camp's healer, a woman whose knowledge of plants and remedies rivaled any Eastern doctor's. Winyan approached Alice, her movements slow and deliberate, and crouched before her. She examined Alice's torn sleeve, the exposed scars, and then lifted her gaze to Alice's face. "These marks," she said in halting English. "Not from accident, from defense." Alice nodded. "Yes. You are a healer like me." "I was. I am not certain what I am now." Winyan's expression softened. "A healer does not stop being a healer because the world breaks her. You will see." She stood and turned to Nayati, switching to Lakota. "Your sister is ill. The fever has returned." Nayati's jaw tightened. "How bad?" "Bad enough. She needs care beyond what I can give. The infection from childbirth has spread. She may not survive the night without stronger medicine." "Where is she?" "In her lodge. She asks for you." Nayati rose immediately, and Alice followed. They crossed the camp to a teepee near the eastern edge, its hide walls painted with symbols of the hunt and the seasons. Inside, a young woman lay on a bed of furs, her face flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and labored. This was Tasunke Hota Nayati's younger sister, barely 22, with dark hair plastered to her forehead and eyes glassy with pain. Beside her, a newborn infant slept in a cradleboard, its tiny fists curled against its chest, oblivious to its mother's struggle. Nayati knelt beside his sister and took her hand. "Tasunke, I am here." Her eyes fluttered open. "Brother," she whispered, "I am glad. You will be well. Winyan is caring for you." "Winyan is old. Her remedies do not work." Tasunke's gaze shifted to Alice, who stood at the entrance uncertain. "Who is she?" "A friend. She has knowledge of healing." Tasunke studied Alice through fever-bright eyes and then nodded weakly. "If she can help, let her." Alice moved forward without hesitation. She knelt beside Tasunke, placed a hand on her forehead, and frowned at the heat radiating from her skin. "How long has she had the fever?" 3 days, Winyan said from the entrance. "The bleeding stopped after birth, but the fever began soon after. I have given her willow bark and poultices, but the infection worsens." Alice examined Tasunke's abdomen, pressing gently around the uterus. Tasunke winced, and Alice pulled back, her expression grave. "There is infection deep in the tissue. It will not heal on its own. She needs stronger medicine, something to draw out the infection and reduce the fever. Without it, the infection will spread to her blood, and she will die within a day." "What do you need?" Nayati asked, his voice tight. "Boiled water, clean cloth, lard and willow bark if you have them, and something to pack the wound, charcoal if available, or crushed yarrow root." Alice paused. "But this is only temporary. To truly heal her, I need surgical tools and ether. I need to drain the infection properly. Dr. Greer in town has these supplies." Nayati relayed the instructions to Winyan, who nodded and left to gather what she could. Alice worked with calm efficiency, directing Nayati to heat water over the fire and tear cloth into strips. When the supplies arrived, she mixed a poultice of willow bark, lard, and charcoal, then applied it to Tasunke's lower abdomen, pressing it firmly into place. She explained each step as she worked, showing Winyan the technique, treating the older woman with the respect due to a fellow healer. Tasunke cried out, and Nayati held her hand, murmuring reassurances in Lakota. Alice did not falter. Her hands were steady, her focus absolute. She had done this before, Nayati realized, had saved lives, in circumstances far worse than a teepee on the prairie. When the poultice was in place, Alice wrapped Tasunke's abdomen with strips of cloth and instructed her to remain still. "The infection will take time to drain. She must drink water and rest. But if the fever does not break by morning, she will die. We need to get to town." Winyan watched Alice work her ancient eyes, taking in every movement, every decision. When Alice finished, the old woman nodded slowly. "You have the hands of a true healer." You see beyond skin and blood. I was wrong to doubt." "You were right to doubt," Alice said quietly. "I am a stranger. But I am also someone who cannot stand by and watch another woman die when I have the skill to save her." Outside, a scream shattered the night. Nayati bolted from the teepee, Alice close behind, and saw chaos erupting at the camp's edge. A cougar, lean and hungry, driven down from the hills by drought, had attacked one of the drying racks, scattering meat across the ground. A boy no more than 8 stood frozen near the racks, his eyes wide with terror, as the great cat turned its yellow gaze on him. Nayati grabbed his rifle, a battered 1873 Winchester. He kept wrapped in oilcloth and ran toward the cougar. The animal turned its yellow eyes, locking onto the boy, and crouched to spring muscles bunching beneath its tawny hide. Nayati fired the shot, cracking through the camp, and the cougar dropped mid-leap, its body crumpling in the grass. The boy stumbled backward, unhurt but shaking. Nayati reached him, checked him for injuries, and handed him off to his mother, who pulled him into a fierce embrace. The camp erupted in shouts and movement, warriors converging on the scene, but the danger had passed. Alice stood near the teepee, her face pale but composed. She had not flinched at the gunfire, had not panicked at the sight of the cougar. Instead, she had stayed calm, ready to act if needed. Her hand rested on the knife Nayati had given her, still tucked into her belt. Nayati returned to her side, his rifle still warm in his hands. "Are you all right?" "Yes, you?" "I am fine." He glanced toward the tree line where shadows moved in the darkness, and Pike's scouts watching the camp. "They are out there." "I know. They will not stop. Neither will we." Nayati looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, and felt something settle inside him. She was right. They would not stop, and neither would he. Together, they returned to Tasunke's teepee, where the fire burned low and the night stretched on heavy with the promise of violence to come. Dawn arrived with the sound of hoofbeats and the sight of a white flag. Dr. Silas Greer and Mabel Finch rode into the Lakota camp on a single horse, the flag tied to a branch and held high by Mabel. Nayati met them at the camp's edge, his rifle slung across his back, his expression wary. "We come in peace," Greer said, dismounting with care. "We need to speak with you, and with Alice." "Why?" "Because Harlan Pike is preparing to move against this camp. He has convinced the army that you are harboring a fugitive. They will arrive by nightfall." "But we also learned something. Something you need to know." Mabel slid down from the horse, her face drawn with worry, and handed Nayati a folded newspaper clipping. "We found this in Pike's room at the inn. It is from a Philadelphia paper 6 years old." Nayati unfolded the clipping and read, "Magnate's death investigated Ambrose Pike Railroad, and steel magnate died suddenly at his Philadelphia estate. Initial autopsy results indicate natural causes, though questions have been raised regarding a contested will. The deceased's grandson, Harlan Pike, has challenged the will's provisions, favoring charitable organizations. Pike has been hunting you for 6 years, Greer said. We need to understand why." Alice emerged from Tasunke's teepee and approached. Greer waited until she arrived, then spoke carefully. "Harlan Pike is the grandson of Ambrose Pike, a railroad magnate who died 6 years ago in Philadelphia. The official cause of death was an aneurysm, a natural death. But there were rumors of poisoning enough to prompt an investigation." Alice stiffened. "I conducted that autopsy. I found no evidence of poison." "We know. But Pike claims otherwise. He says the telegraph report you filed contradicted your findings, that it suggested poisoning could not be ruled out. That report was used to challenge his grandfather's will, which left a significant portion of the estate to charitable causes. The will was contested, and the case has been tied up in probate for years. I never filed such a report." Alice said, her voice cold. I sent a single message to Judge Mercer confirming natural causes. If another report exists, it was fabricated. Mabel stepped forward. We spoke to a clerk at the Red Oak Telegraph office last night. He admitted that reports can be copied and altered during transmission, especially back east, where multiple clerks handle messages. If someone had access to the Philadelphia line, say a relative of the deceased, with connections to the telegraph company, they could change the message before it reached its destination. Alice's hand went to her mouth. Pike altered the report. He changed my findings to implicate me, knowing it would cast doubt on the autopsy and allow him to contest the will. Yes, Greer said. But there is more. He pulled a folded sheet from his coat and handed it to Alice. This is a copy of a medical school registry we found among Pike's papers. Harlan Pike was a student at the University of Pennsylvania, enrolled in the same program as the lead coroner who supervised your autopsy. He was expelled for falsifying autopsy records in another case. Alice unfolded the registry and stared at the signature at the bottom. Her hands began to tremble. This is his handwriting. I recognize it. He was present at the autopsy. He assisted the coroner. He pressured us to find evidence of poisoning, kept insisting we must have missed something. Why? Nayati asked. Because if the death was ruled natural, the will would stand, and the charitable organizations would receive their inheritance. But if it was ruled suspicious, the estate would be frozen pending investigation. That would give Pike time to manipulate the proceedings and claim the inheritance for himself. Alice's voice dropped. When I refused to falsify my findings, he attacked me. He had a surgical knife, one used for dissections. He tried to force me to sign a false report. I fought him. I took the knife and used it to defend myself. These, she touched the scars on her wrist, are from that fight. The coroner heard the struggle and intervened, pulled Pike off me. But Pike threatened to ruin my career if I spoke out. He said no one would believe a woman over a man with his family's connections. So I fled. I came west, changed my name, and took the telegraph position in Red Oak. I thought I was safe. You kept the ledger, Greer said gently. Why? Because it is the only proof of what really happened. It contains my original notes, my findings, and the signatures of everyone present at the autopsy, including Pike's. If I ever needed to defend myself, it was my only weapon. Alice opened the ledger to a page near the back. But there is something else. Something I documented but never reported. Before the autopsy, I overheard Pike arguing with another man, a business associate of his grandfather's, named Thomas Brennan. Pike was threatening him, saying if Brennan did not support the poisoning claim, he would reveal that Brennan had embezzled from the company. 2 weeks after the autopsy, Brennan was found dead in his office. They ruled it suicide, a pistol in his hand, a note about financial ruin. But I saw Pike leaving that building the night before Brennan died. I documented what I saw, but I had no proof, and I was already terrified Pike would come after me. Greer's face went pale. You believe Pike killed him? I cannot prove it, but yes. I believe Pike murdered him to silence him, then staged it to look like suicide. Mabel gasped. Then this is not just about fraud. This is about murder. A voice spoke from behind them, low and rough. It is. They turned to see a man approaching a drifter in his 30s, with haunted eyes and nervous hands. He wore dusty trail clothes and carried a rifle across his back. Nayati recognized him from Pike's crew, but had never seen him up close. This is Clancy Holt, Greer said quietly. He has been working for Pike, but he came to me last night. He wants to help. Nayati studied Holt carefully. Why should we trust you? You should not, Holt said, his voice rough. I have done things I am not proud of. But I did not sign up for murder. He looked at Alice. Thomas Brennan was my half-brother. We had the same mother, different fathers. He raised me after she died. When I heard he was dead, I knew something was wrong. He was not the kind of man to take his own life. But I had no proof. Not until I heard you just now talking about what you saw. Alice stared at him. You are Brennan's brother. I am. And I have been working for Pike for 2 years, trying to get close enough to learn the truth. When I heard he was coming west to find you, I followed. I have been feeding him false information, trying to slow him down. But his enforcer, a man named Bede Purcell, he is the real danger. Purcell killed Ephraim Tully last night. Alice's face went pale. Ephraim is dead. Yes. Shot during a cattle stampede, Purcell started to cover their tracks. His wife fled. I do not know where she went. Holt's voice cracked. And Purcell is planning to burn this camp to the ground tonight. He has orders from Pike to eliminate everyone who might testify against him. That includes all of you. Nayati's blood ran cold. When? Within the hour. Maybe less. Then we move now, Nayati said. We get the supplies Alice needs for Tasunki, and we prepare to fight. There is another way, Holt said. There is an old mine adit near Ephraim's farm. If we can get there, we can hole up and make them come to us on our terms. The terrain favors defense. Nayati considered this. We need to go to town first. Alice's sister will die without proper medicine. Then we go quickly, Holt said. I will help you. They moved fast. Greer had already gathered supplies, ether sutures, scalpel clamps, anticipating Alice's needs. He loaded them into a saddlebag while Mabel kept watch. Nayati, Alice, and Holt slipped out the back of Greer's office and ran toward the rail yard. But Purcell's men were already closing in their lanterns, bobbing in the dark. In that decade, ether served as a common surgical anesthetic in frontier practice, and incision and drainage was the standard life-saving treatment for deep abscesses. It was the safest choice Greer could make with the tools at hand. A bullet struck the ground near Alice's feet, kicking up dirt. Nayati grabbed her arm, pulling her behind a stack of lumber. Another shot followed, splintering the wood above their heads. Holt returned fire, his rifle crack echoing through the night, and one of Purcell's men went down clutching his shoulder. This way. Holt led them toward the canyon trail, a narrow path that wound through the hills toward Ephraim's abandoned farm. They ran through the darkness, the rain beginning to fall, turning the trail slick and treacherous. Lightning flashed, illuminating the landscape in stark relief. And thunder rolled across the hills like artillery fire. The mine adit loomed ahead, a black mouth in the hillside, and they ducked inside, just as Purcell and his men reached the trail. Inside the adit, the air was damp and cold, the walls slick with moisture. Nayati lit a lantern, and the dim light revealed a cramped space reinforced with rotting timber beams. Water seeped through cracks in the ceiling, pooling on the floor, and the smell of old earth and rust filled the air. Broken mining equipment lay scattered about, rusted picks of bent shovel coils of rope. Alice set down her satchel and began preparing to work on Tasunke when they returned, but they all knew they would not make it back to camp in time. Tasunke was dying, and they were trapped. Greer shook his head. We need to draw Purcell away from the camp. If we can capture Pike and force a confession. He will never confess, Alice said flatly. Then we make him, Holt said. Before anyone could respond, voices echoed from the adit's entrance. Harlan Pike himself appeared, flanked by Bede Purcell and 3 other men. Pike's suit was muddy, his face twisted with fury, but there was something else in his expression. Triumph, as though he had finally cornered his prey. "Give me the ledger, Miss Garrett." Pike said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "And I will let the rest of you live." Alice did not move. "You will kill us regardless. You killed Thomas Brennan. You killed Ephraim. You will kill anyone who stands in your way." Pike's eyes narrowed. Brennan was a fool who could not keep his mouth shut. And Tully was collateral damage. But you are the only one who truly matters. Give me the ledger, and I will make your death quick. No. Nayati raised his rifle, but Purcell's men already had theirs trained on him. It was a standoff, 5 armed men against 4-3, if you did not count Greer, who was no fighter. Then Holt stepped forward, his rifle aimed not at Nayati, but at Purcell. "I am done with this," he said quietly. "Brennan did not deserve to die, and neither does she." Purcell turned, his expression cold. "You are a fool, Holt. You always were. Your brother was weak, and so are you. Maybe. But I am not a murderer." Purcell laughed. "You think you can shoot me and walk away. Pike pays well. These men are loyal. To money, not to you." Holt's voice hardened. "I know what you did. I know you shot Brennan and put the pistol in his hand. I know because you bragged about it one night when you were drunk. You said it was the easiest money you ever made." Purcell's face went white, then red with rage. He moved to shoot, but Holt fired first. The bullet struck Purcell in the chest, and the man staggered backward, his rifle dropping from his hands. He fell to his knees, then collapsed onto the wet ground, blood spreading across his shirt. But Purcell was not finished. With his last strength, he raised his pistol and fired at the nearest support beam. The wood splintered and the ceiling groaned. He fired again and again, each shot deliberate, meant to bring the adit down on all of them. "If I die, you all die," Purcell rasped, then fired one more time before his hand fell and he went still. The adit shuddered. Water began pouring through the widening cracks, and one of Pike's men panicked and fled toward the entrance. The others hesitated, and in that moment, Pike lunged for the ledger. Nayati intercepted him. They crashed together, grappling in the shallow water pooling on the floor. Pike fought with the desperation of a man who had everything to lose, his hands clawing at Nayati's face, his knee driving toward Nayati's groin. Nayati blocked the knee and drove his forehead into Pike's nose. Bone crunched and blood sprayed, but Pike did not stop. He pulled a small derringer from his coat and pressed it against Nayati's ribs. Alice saw the gun and moved. She grabbed the rusted pick from the ground and swung it at Pike's arm. The pick's blunt end struck Pike's wrist, and the derringer fell into the water. Pike screamed and backhanded Alice, sending her sprawling. Nayati's vision went red. He drove his fist into Pike's throat once, twice, then slammed the man's head against the rock wall. Pike's eyes rolled back and his body went limp. But the damage was done. The support beam Purcell had shot splintered completely, and a section of the ceiling collapsed. Rock and timber crashed down, blocking the main entrance. Water surged through the gaps, and flames from the overturned lantern spread across the oil-slicked surface. "Out!" Nayati shouted. "Everyone out!" But the way was blocked by falling debris. Holt, weakened by his shoulder wound, stumbled and fell. Greer grabbed him, pulling him to his feet, while Mabel and Alice searched desperately for another exit. The fire spread, feeding on the dry timber, and the oil and the smoke thickened, choking them. "There!" Alice pointed to a narrow passage at the rear of the adit, barely visible through the smoke. "Through there." They ran, the heat searing their lungs, the smoke blinding them. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for one person at a time, and the walls pressed in on all sides. Nayati went first, forcing his body through the narrow gap, then reached back to pull Alice through. Greer pushed Holt ahead, and Mabel followed, coughing violently. Halfway through, a timber beam above them cracked. Nayati looked up and saw it beginning to fall directly onto Alice, who was still halfway through the passage. He threw himself backward, bracing his shoulders against the walls and catching the beam with his back and arms. The weight was immense, crushing, and he felt something tear in his shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he held the beam, his muscles screaming while Alice scrambled forward. "Go!" he shouted. "All of you go!" Alice looked back, her face stricken. "I will not leave you." "You will." Nayati's voice was raw. "Get them out." Mabel grabbed Alice and pulled her forward. Greer and Holt had already made it through. Alice fought for a moment, then stopped fighting and crawled through the rest of the passage. The moment she cleared it, Nayati let go of the beam and threw himself forward. The beam crashed down behind him, sealing the passage, and he tumbled into the cavern beyond. They were in a natural chamber, its ceiling partially collapsed to allow rain and moonlight to pour through. Nayati lay on the ground, gasping for air, his shoulder throbbing. Alice knelt beside him immediately, her hands checking for injuries. "You are hurt," she said, her voice shaking. "I am alive. We all are." "Barely." They heard no screams from the passage behind them. Pike had not followed. Neither had his remaining men. The adit had collapsed completely, burying them beneath tons of rock and water. "Is he dead?" Mabel asked, her voice shaking. "Yes," Nayati said grimly. "And Purcell with him." Alice sank to her knees, the ledger clutched to her chest, and for the first time since Nayati had met her, she allowed herself to cry, not with grief, but with the overwhelming relief of someone who had carried a terrible burden for too long and could finally set it down. Nayati sat up slowly, his shoulders screaming in protest, and placed his hand on hers. She did not pull away. She gripped his hand tightly, as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth, and they sat together in the rain-washed cavern, while the others caught their breath and the night slowly gave way to dawn. The gray light of dawn spread across the Lakota camp when they finally returned. They had walked through the night, Nayati's shoulder wrapped in strips torn from Alice's dress, Holt barely able to stand. A small group of soldiers had arrived at the camp, but these were not the hostile force Pike had promised. Instead, a young lieutenant listened as Greer explained what had happened, and he examined the ledger and the medical registry with careful attention. "This is a serious matter," the lieutenant said. "I will need to forward these documents to Fort Kearney, and from there to the proper authorities in Philadelphia. Miss Garrett, you will need to give your full testimony." Alice nodded, exhausted. "I will." Nayati left them talking and went to Tasunke's teepee. His sister was still alive, barely, her breathing shallow. Winyan sat beside her, keeping vigil, but she shook her head when Nayati entered. "She is fading," the old woman said. Alice entered behind him, carrying the medical supplies. "Not yet. Hold her steady." What followed was 2 hours of careful, precise work. Alice used the ether to put Tasunke into a deep sleep, then made a small incision to drain the infection. She worked by lantern light, her hands steady despite exhaustion, showing Winyan each step. When it was done, she packed the wound with clean cloth soaked in willow bark solution and wrapped Tasunke's abdomen in fresh bandages. "She will live," Alice said finally, sitting back on her heels. "The fever should break by tonight." Winyan placed her hand on Alice's shoulder. "You have saved her, and you have taught me something new. For that you will always be welcome in this camp." Alice looked at the old woman, then at Nayati, and nodded silently, too tired for words. The soldiers left, taking statements and promising to return with news from Philadelphia. Ephraim's body was recovered from his farm, and buried beneath the cedar tree where his son lay. His wife returned, drawn back by news of Pike's death, and she stood silent and dry-eyed as they lowered him into the ground. Greer spoke words of comfort, and Mabel placed wildflowers on the grave. Alice stood beside Nayati, her hand in his, and together they watched as the earth claimed another good man. But this time, his sacrifice had not been in vain. His land would remain with his family protected now by the exposure of Pike's fraud. He would have been glad, Alice said quietly. Yes, he would have. Over the following weeks, the telegraph lines were repaired, and messages flew back and forth between Red Oak and Philadelphia. Judge Mercer responded swiftly. The warrant for Alice's arrest had been lifted. Edmund Carr, the telegraph clerk who had altered the messages, had been found and arrested in Baltimore. His testimony, combined with the evidence Alice provided and Holt's statement about his brother's murder, was enough to confirm everything. The investigation also uncovered the hidden codicil in Ambrose Pike's will, a document Harlan had deliberately concealed. The codicil redistributed portions of the estate to families displaced by railroad expansion, including Ephraim's widow, who retained the farm with all debts forgiven. The school and Dr. Greer's practice received funding to continue their work, and several other families in Red Oak benefited as well. Alice stood in the repaired telegraph station, reading the final message from Judge Mercer, and felt something inside her finally release. She was free. "It is over," Greer said gently, standing beside her. "You are free." "I am," Alice replied, and this time she believed it. 3 months later, on a warm afternoon in early autumn, Alice sat on the porch of the new medical clinic that had been built on the edge of Red Oak. The building was simple but sturdy, with a waiting room, an examination room, and living quarters in the back. Judge Mercer had provided the funds honoring his friend Ambrose's original intentions for the estate. Nayati approached, leading his mule. He had been at the Lakota camp where Tasunki was now fully recovered and her baby thriving. He tied the mule to the post and climbed the porch steps. "Busy?" he asked. "Always." Alice gestured to the empty chairs. "But I can spare a moment." He sat beside her, and for a while they simply watched the town go about its business. The drought had finally broken. Rain had come and the prairie was beginning to green again. "I spoke with Mado," Nayati said. "He wants to know if you will come teach Winyan more of your techniques. She is eager to learn." "I will. I promised her I would." "Good." Nayati paused. "And I have been thinking. This clinic serves settlers well, but the Lakota have no one close by when they need help. If you were willing, we could establish a second location, closer to the camp." Alice turned to look at him. I would help. You know this land and these people, but you also know that trust is hard won. I can help build that bridge." She studied his face, seeing the sincerity there, and felt something warm settle in her chest. "I would like that." "Then it is decided." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment longer. Then Alice reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass telegraph keys she had salvaged from the old station. "I want you to keep this." "Why?" "Because it reminds me that we are never truly alone. That messages can cross distances, that help can come even when we think we are isolated. And because I want you to remember that you matter. Not just to your people, but to others. To me." Nayati took the key, its weight solid in his hand. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a rawhide cord, simple and strong. "For you. My sister made it. She says it is for protection on long journeys." Alice took the cord and tied it around her wrist. "Thank you." They stood together, the prairie stretching out around them, the sky vast and open. In the distance, the Lakota camp sent up threads of smoke, and beyond that, the land rolled on, forever, indifferent and eternal. Will you stay? Nayati asked quietly. Yes, Alice said. I will stay. It was not a promise of romance, not yet. It was something simpler and more profound, a commitment to build something together, to stand against whatever came next, to make a place where healing could happen and trust could grow. That evening, as the sun set over the prairie painting, the world in shades of gold and red, Alice tapped out a message on the telegraph key, I am alive. Nayati knocked 3 times on the porch railing, the sound echoing across the open land, stay. And she would. They both would. Because they had found something worth staying for, something worth fighting for, something that had been forged in fire and flood, and the refusal to give up. They had found each other, and that in the end was enough.